This is the RAZER Atlas, Razer's first and only entry into the glasspad market to date, but one that, despite being released in 2023, was well ahead of the glasspad market in many ways. Now, traditionally speaking, glasspads released by mainstream brands are often underwhelming, as the pads are usually poorly designed and or use outdated base or surfacing designs. But the Atlas, in my opinion, is a notable exception from this trend, as the Atlas not only has great performance, the design of the pad surfacing was well ahead of the market for a glass pad released in 2023. And even 2 years after the pad was released, the pad surface is still a standout in terms of performance and notably sensor compatibility. But sadly, while the surfacing is great, other aspects of the Atlas haven't aged the best, making the pad a rather odd pad in today's glass pad market, as it has comparable performance to modern glass pad offerings, but in a very outdated design. But is the pad's performance and surfacing enough to make the Atlas a viable pad in 2025, or has it been outclassed by more modern glasspad releases? We're going to answer those questions as well as take a deep dive into Razer's first and only glasspad and talk all about the Atlas's pros and cons and much more in today's episode of the mel0n Review. But before we get into it, if you enjoyed the video and want to see more glasspad reviews like this one, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And if you want to support what I do here on the channel with these in-depth reviews and of course the teardown project, consider becoming a channel member, as it is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, and it gives you early access to all upcoming episodes of the mel0n Review and Teardown. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I tested the Atlas for about 6 weeks, daily driving the pad for both work and gaming use. For skates, I tested some stock PTFE skates on the Atlas, as well as some more glasspad optimized skates such as the X-Ray Pad Jade, Obsidian, and Pro Air series skates. I also tested the Atlas with multiple mice in order to check its compatibility with 3395, 3950, and 3970 series sensors, but I mainly used the 3950 and 3970 series sensors for the majority of my testing, and for sensitivity I played on my usual range of 40 to 50 cm per 360 here on the Atlas. For pricing and versions, the Atlas is available in 2 colors, black and white, and both colorways are only available in one size, a 450 by 400 by 5mm size, and this one size retails for $144.99 Canadian dollars, or around $105 USD. While this is definitely a very steep price from a glass pad released almost 2 years ago, keep in mind that since the Atlas is a Razer product, not only is it available at most online retailers, it's also one of the only glass pads you can purchase at a physical store like a Best Buy, for example, as other glass pads released by Glassworks and Wallhack, for example, are only available online, meaning you'll have to pay shipping and even import fees on said pads, whereas with the Atlas, you can just walk into a brick and mortar store and buy it for a flat cost. Now, admittedly, this isn't an important factor for enthusiasts like us, but for general consumers who want to try a glass pad, having physical stock at a store is very important, as it takes a lot of the risk out of trying a glass pad like the Atlas, whereas with other glass pads, due to shipping and online returns, they're a much riskier proposition to try from a consumer's perspective. For unboxing, the Atlas comes in a larger box, which is a little thinner than the boxes we've seen traditionally used for other glass pads, but to account for the box's thinness, the inside of the box has a lot of cushioning foam inside it, specifically around the edges of the Atlas, which is great to see. But interestingly enough, there is this little safety and maintenance guide wrapped around the edge of the pad, which gives you a quick rundown of what not to do with the glass pad and also gives you instructions on how to care and clean the pad, which is a really nice attention to detail which is often missed by many other glass pad brands. Now, aside from the pad itself and the maintenance guide, there are no other accessories included here with the Atlas, so unlike many other glass pads that are available on the market, which include accessories like skates, cleaning cloths, stickers, and other things, the Atlas just includes the pad itself. But to be fair to Razer, the Atlas was released before including stock skates or other accessories with a glass pad was commonplace, so I'm going to give Razer a pass here, but on a future version of the Atlas, this pad should absolutely include accessories like a cleaning cloth, an arm sleeve, glass pad optimized skates, and maybe even some stickers, the same type that Razer includes with their other mice. And lastly, in terms of warranty, the Atlas has a 1-year manufacturer warranty through Razer, and you can find all the terms and conditions for said warranty on Razer's website. Now, for performance, I'll admit that initially my expectations for the Atlas were quite low. As I mentioned earlier, traditionally glass pads and most pad types for that matter that are released by mainstream brands are quite underwhelming, but the Atlas's performance and overall usage experience was very different from this traditional pattern and was actually surprisingly good. The most surprising aspect in my opinion about the Atlas is its surfacing, as the pad's 2 micrometer surface texturing when combined with the pad's coating not only gives the Atlas a more balanced speed performance profile and makes the pad surprisingly non-stick, it also makes the pad fully compatible with all sensor types, including the PAW 3395, 3950, and 3970 series sensors. This is an aspect to the Atlas that is very impressive considering it was released in 2023, as many glass pads, even more modern ones, aren't compatible with some sensor types depending on the surfacing's design. So even though the Atlas was released 2 years ago, RAZER was well ahead of the rest of the market in this regard, as the pad sensor compatibility is amazing and still is to this day on even more modern sensors. Aside from the great surface design, the pad's in-game performance was also very good, as the pad performed very well in dynamic and tracking aim types as expected. The Atlas was also okay for more static and flicking aiming types, but only when used with very control optimized skates, but still usable by all means. But while the pad's performance and surfacing was very well designed by RAZER, the other aspects of the Atlas definitely show their age, as not only is the glass 4mm thick and the base is 1mm thick, making the Atlas 5mm thick, the pad sizing is also on the smaller side. Because of the sizing constraints, I did run into some issues playing at 50cm per 360 or higher, as I find myself running out of horizontal space quite frequently, but on 40cm per 360 and lower sensitivity ranges I didn't have any issues with the Atlas size. But again, to be fair to RAZER, thicker glass and smaller sizes were the standard, so to speak, for glass pads when the Atlas was released, but compared to other glass pads on the market today, these aspects of the Atlas definitely negate the Atlas's overall usage experience. So while the Atlas's in-game performance and surfacing is fantastic, again being well ahead of the curve for a pad released in 2023 in my opinion, time is sadly the Achilles heel of the Atlas, as more modern glass pads offer similar performance profiles but in larger and thinner form factors, giving more modern glass pads an edge over the Atlas despite the pad's great performance and surfacing design. Now, as a quick precursor to this section, keep in mind that my Atlas was sent to me directly from RAZER, so take the build quality and QC of my Atlas with a grain of salt. For build, the Atlas uses the typical glass pad design, having a core glass layer of tempered glass, a rubber base attached to its base, and a coating layer applied to the surface, the same design we see on most glass pads on the market. But to RAZER's credit, the build quality and QC of the Atlas is pretty good, as the surface coating has been applied perfectly with no dead zones or uneven areas, but I can't say the same for the base, as not only is it not aligned properly, it's also a few millimeters shorter than the glass itself. But considering that many glass pads released around the time of the Atlas use the less efficient foot designs, despite the base's smaller size and wonky design, I'm very happy to see that they used a full rubber base here on the Atlas as opposed to the foot design. For surfacing, as I mentioned earlier, the Atlas is using a surprisingly well-designed surfacing, which not only feels great to use and performs amazingly, it's also surprisingly quiet. Now, the pad surfacing, as defined by RAZER, is a micro-etched surfacing with 2 micrometer texturing, which has been designed to be fully compatible with optical sensors, which, as we just talked about a moment ago, is true, as all the sensor versions I tested here on the Atlas worked perfectly. But as expected for a glass pad, the surfacing has been coated with an oleophobic coating with a 9H hardness on the pencil scale, which is a scale commonly used to measure the durability of glass screen protectors, which means that the Atlas's surface coating can withstand scratches and wear and tear from a pencil with the hardest graphite tip available, the 9H. Now, thankfully for the Atlas, mel skates aren't made from graphite, so this rating doesn't mean much, but a 9H pencil scale rating is roughly equivalent to a Mohs hardness of 3, which is obviously on the lower end of the Mohs hardness scale, which means that the coating can only be damaged by copper metals such as a penny or any denser, harder materials. Now, thankfully again for the Atlas, copper mel skates don't exist, so the Atlas's surface will resist any scratching from softer materials such as PTFE, hardened PTFE, and high density materials and plastics, but any harder materials such as metals, glass, ceramic, and gems will damage the pad's surfacing, so be sure to only use traditional skate materials here on the Atlas, and be careful not to drop anything on the pad, and please don't use the pad as a coat coaster for your coffee mug, as ceramics can of course damage the surface. Now to talk more about the pad's oleophobic coating, this coating is designed so it resists oily substances as well as other moisture sources. As such, the Atlas's surface isn't significantly affected by such sources, which also makes the pad surprisingly non-stick as I mentioned earlier, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. However, I did notice that over my testing, the Atlas did form buildup of oils and debris slightly faster than other glass pad types did over my testing, similar to what happened on the TGX Kin X, but to a lower degree here on the Atlas. Now this is to be expected as all glass pads and hard pads do build up debris to some degree, but slightly more so here on the Atlas than other glass pads I've used. As such, I would highly recommend cleaning the pad frequently with a warm damp cloth and wiping the pad off before and after use with a microfiber cloth to keep the surface as clean as possible to ensure that there aren't any oddities to the Atlas's surface due to buildup. Speaking of surface feel, the Atlas surface is surprisingly smooth to the touch, having a semi-textured feeling when gliding your mouse across it, which does make the pad friendlier quote-unquote to 100% PTFE skates, but these skate types will still wear at a much faster rate than hard pad optimized skates will, and we'll talk more about the pad's compatibility with different skates later. But while RAZER did a lot right with the surfacing here on the Atlas, one very odd and questionable aspect to the design of the surfacing here is its logo, as instead of the RAZER logo being under the glass like we commonly see, the logo is etched into the pad's surface, and the etched areas of this logo have a different texture compared to the rest of the Atlas's surface, being non-textured and smooth like the CNC'd edges of the pad. So while the RAZER logo does look better than pads that place their logo under the glass's surface, the difference in texturing does feel very jarring when you run your mouse over it. Now I initially oriented my pad with the logo towards the bottom, and in this position due to the smaller size I did find myself running over the logo quite often, which did lead to some performance issues, so I would highly advise orienting the pad where the logo is towards the top so there's a lesser chance of you running your mouse over it. Admittedly, I am being rather nitpicky here in this regards, and while the logo design isn't the biggest issue in most use cases, I do think RAZER could improve this aspect on a future version of the Atlas, as putting the logo beneath the pad surface would be a much better design and wouldn't cause any performance issues on a future Atlas, particularly on smaller sizes. Now, as another precursor, my experience in estimated performance profiles here on the Atlas is based on testing with 8 6.5mm dot skates, the standard skate type included and used for most glass pads, not traditional full-size skates, and keep in mind that various skate materials, shapes, sizes, as well as your grip style and hand weight can alter the performance profiles of the Atlas, so use these estimated performance profiles as rough estimates here for the Atlas. Now, for the Atlas's performance or friction profiles, the RAZER isn't specifically advertising a set performance profile for the Atlas, but since the pad is a glass pad and since their marketing describes the pad as having ultra low degrees of static and dynamic friction, my initial assumption is that the Atlas would have a speed optimized performance profile, but in reality the pad is more of a balanced or balanced adjacent performance profiles depending on the skate types used on the pad. As such, when using standard PTFE skates such as the X-Ray Pad Jade or Jade Air 6.5mm dots, Ghost Glide Edge Runner dots, Unusual Way Sports Silver Fox or Magic Ice skates, or an equivalent PTFE dot skate, the Atlas will obviously be on the faster side as 100% PTFE material is a lower friction material, which gives the Atlas a speed balanced performance profile having low degrees of both initial and braking frictions, though not anywhere close to the ultra low degrees advertised by RAZER, but still quite fast. But uniquely, the dynamic friction here on the Atlas with this skate type is higher than expected, being around the low to medium range due to what I assume is the Atlas's texturing digging into the softer PTFE material, causing increased friction on dynamic movements, hence the higher than expected dynamic friction. But despite the slight oddities with this skate type, using these skates on the Atlas will give the pad the aforementioned speed balanced performance profile, which makes the pad ideal for tracking and dynamic aiming, less so for static and flicking aiming due to the lack of friction. However, this skate material has very poor durability when it comes to hard pad usage, which can lead to some performance impacts, and we'll talk more about this later in this video. Next, when using hardened PTFE skates such as the X-Ray Pad Obsidian or Obsidian Air 6.5mm dots, the Ghost Glide Cyclones or Cyclone Pros, or an equivalent hardened PTFE material skate, the skate's hardened higher friction material marginally increases the degrees of friction felt on the Atlas, giving the pad a medium degree of both initial and braking friction, frictions, as well as a medium-ish degree of dynamic friction, which gives the Atlas a more balanced performance profile, one which is, again, ideal for tracking and dynamic aiming, but also offers slightly improved performance in static and flicking aiming due to the increased degrees of frictions, but not by a high enough degree where I'd recommend using the Atlas for static and flicking aiming still. But one notable improvement to the Atlas's usage experience with this skate type is that unlike standard PTFE skates, this hardened material has much better durability on hard pads, which makes these skates immune to any performance inconsistencies from wear and tear, unlike the standard PTFE skates we just talked about, which can suffer a lot of inconsistency in their performance as they're worn down by a hard pad surface, and we'll talk more about what skate type you should use here on the Atlas in a moment. And lastly, using skates made of ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, or better known as UHMWPE materials, such as the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Pro Air 6.5mm dots or the Unusual Way Sports Black Fox skates, this denser, higher molecular weight, higher friction skate material significantly slows down the Atlas's natural speed and drastically increases the pad's frictions, giving the Atlas a medium-high degree of initial and braking frictions and a higher degree of dynamic friction. But despite the increased frictions, these skate types still give the Atlas a balanced performance profile, but one that has a higher emphasis on control, but not to a high enough degree to reclassify the pad's performance profile as balance controlled. As such, with this balanced performance profile that leans more towards the control side of the spectrum, the increased control does allow the Atlas to still be well suited for dynamic and tracking aiming. It'll just be much more controlled than the experience will be with other skate types, while also making the pad much more consistent for static and flicking aiming, more so than any other skate type I've covered. This skate material also has the benefit of having the highest durability of any skate type I've covered today, having superior durability to even hardened PTFE, which further increases the lifespan of this skate type when used on the Atlas, while also maintaining the immunity to any performance inconsistencies from wear and tear. For the Atlas's skate compatibility, as I mentioned earlier and as expected for a hard pad, the Atlas is only compatible with traditional, softer material skates such as PTFE, hardened PTFE, and UHMWPE, whereas harder material skates such as metal, glass, ceramic, and gem are incompatible with the pad as they can damage the pad's coating and/or surface. But oddly enough, RAZER says that the Atlas should be used with the original mouse feet included on a RAZER mouse or an equivalent PTFE replacement skate. Now, given the release time for the Atlas, I'm not going to harp on them too much with this outdated information, but as a rule of thumb, you should always use hardened PTFE or UHMWPE material skates on all hard pads, as non-hardened PTFE skates, as I talked about earlier, wear very quickly on hard pad types and can suffer performance inconsistencies as they're worn down by the hard pad surface. Whereas on the other hand, hardened PTFE or UHMWPE material skates, while they are slower, offer superior durability and more consistent performance as they're much more resistant to wear. You can of course use standard PTFE skates anyways despite their poor durability, but if you do so, be sure to replace these types of skates every month or so, as that's the average lifespan of most PTFE skates on hard pads like the Atlas. As such, and as I mentioned earlier, over my testing of the Atlas, I primarily used the pad with hard pad optimized skates such as the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air and Air Pro dots in this case, as they help to not only make the pad a little more controllable, they were much more durable and didn't have any performance inconsistencies due to wear and tear. And another notable aspect to the Atlas that I touched on earlier is that the pad is surprisingly quiet due in part to the surface's smoothness, but mainly the large rubber base. So even when using mouse skates that aren't optimized for hard pads like the Ghost Glide Cyclone dots or the regular X-Ray Pad Obsidian skates for example, the degree of audio feedback from the Atlas is actually quite tolerable. But that said, using glass pad optimized skates that have a dampening layer such as the Ghost Glide Cyclone Pros or the X-Ray Pad Air or Ultra series skates will significantly reduce the pad's audio feedback. For a base, the Atlas uses a familiar rubber base type similar to the base styles used on the Ponage Ultraglide and Glassworks Kazemi, having the same raised hexagonal texturing running across its base. Now, while the base isn't installed very well and despite its odd dimensions, the base does perform great, and combined with the pad's natural weight, the pad anchors itself to almost all desktop surfaces very well, and even with heavy pressure applied to the pad's surface, the large rubber base kept the Atlas perfectly anchored in place. But while the Atlas's base performed great, it does share the same downsides as the similar bases I mentioned earlier, as the gaps between the raised hexagonal texturing does fill with debris quite quickly, especially around the edges of the pad. And due to the depth of the texturing, debris that gets lodged between these hexagonal cells is extremely difficult to remove, so naturally over time the Atlas's base will become quite dirty, especially around the edges. But since this is on the base of the pad, this isn't that big of a deal per se, as this is purely a cosmetic issue and debris never affected the anchoring strength of the base, but on a future version of the Atlas, it would be nice to see a flatter base design similar to the base style used on the Lock-On Harut, as it's much easier to clean due to its flattened texture while having a similar level of anchoring strength. For edges, as I mentioned earlier, the Atlas uses CNC'd rounded edges, which are very different from the beveled edges we see commonly used on many more modern glass pads. Now, since the Atlas was released before many more modern glass pads, of course, the edge design is fine, as this was the standard design when it was released, but due to the pad's 5mm thickness, the edge, despite its roundness, is slightly more noticeable than the rounded edges on thinner glass pads are, which means you might feel more of an edge, so to speak, when moving your arm up or down the edges of the Atlas, causing a slight degree of additional drag on movements across the pad's edges than you'd experience on a thinner glass pad or a pad with a beveled edge. It's also worth noting that the edges of the Atlas don't have the same texturing as its surface, but since the rounding of the edges here is thinner despite the non-textured surfacing, the pad's edges don't have that stickiness you'll find on more pronounced non-textured edges, so the edges of the Atlas won't cause any significant additional drag due to stickiness due to its non-coated surface. However, again, due to the height of the edge stitching, you might notice it more than you will on thinner pads. For the effects of moisture, since the Atlas is a glass pad, the pad is immune to humidity and most other environmental moisture sources, but unlike many other glass pads, when exposed to sweat from your arms or hands, the Atlas doesn't get as sticky as many other glass pads do. This is largely due to the aforementioned oleophobic coating as well as the surface's texturing. As such, even with my sweatier hands and arms, I was able to use the Atlas quite comfortably without a sleeve in most situations, but if my office got very hot and I started to sweat a lot more than usual, the pad did start to get somewhat sticky, but only under very specific circumstances. But despite the Atlas's ability to handle moisture so well, due to the extreme summer heat we're currently experiencing here in Canada, I did find myself using an arm sleeve with the Atlas as it prevented sweat from making the pad semi-sticky. But if I was using the Atlas in cooler weather, I don't think I need a sleeve at all, but I would still recommend using one due to the pad's unique attraction to debris, and we'll talk more about this as well as the advantages of using an arm sleeve in a moment. And in terms of the effects of dust and debris, since the Atlas is a hard pad, the pad is largely immune to most debris types, but as I mentioned earlier, the surface does build up debris on its texturing if not cleaned frequently, especially when using the pad without an arm sleeve, and this buildup can affect the pad's performance if the surface isn't cleaned often. Because of this, as I mentioned earlier, I'd highly recommend deep cleaning the pad frequently, which you can do so by wiping the pad surface with a warm, damp cloth to remove any buildup from the pad surface, and keep in mind you can further deter buildup from accumulating on the pad surface by using an arm sleeve, as the sleeve acts as a barrier, so to speak, preventing dead skin, oils, and sweat from your arms or hands from making contact with the Atlas's surface. And for larger debris types, they'll only impact the pad if they rest on the pad surface and your mouse happens to catch on them when you swipe it across the pad, creating that scratchy sound and feeling. But you can prevent this, as I mentioned earlier, by wiping the pad surface down with a microfiber cloth before and after use to get rid of any larger debris types that are resting against the pad, and I would highly recommend doing this very frequently, especially if you have pets. And for arm sleeve compatibility, the Atlas, being a hard pad, is compatible with all arm sleeve types, either gaming optimized ones or athletic ones, and while the pad surface is surprisingly non-stick, as we just mentioned, using an arm sleeve is still recommended to prevent any moisture related issues and to prevent unwanted debris buildup on the pad surface. But despite the pad's compatibility with all arm sleeve types, I'd still recommend using a gaming optimized sleeve for the best experience, as the materials used in athletic sleeve often aren't as durable as the material material blends used in gaming optimized ones. Alright, well in closing, for the Atlas being a glass pad released by a mainstream brand, there is a lot to like here as the pad's performance is really good, the surfacing is very well designed, and it's not only compatible with all sensor types, it's also surprisingly non-stick, and the surfacing is very quiet. And the pad's base, while it wasn't installed correctly on my unit, did perform great as well and is a much better base design than the foot designs commonly used on many glass pads released around the time of the Atlas. And of course, it's important to again highlight that this is one of the only glass pads you can buy from a brick and mortar store. But the Atlas is very expensive and the price hasn't been adjusted to account for its age. The pad's one sizing is also an issue as it's on the smaller side for a glass pad, so users with higher centimeter per 360s might run into space limitation issues. The pad itself is also very thick and the RAZER logo is etched into the surface, which in some orientations can cause performance issues, and the pad doesn't include any accessories, which again, to be fair to RAZER, wasn't standard when the pad was released, but it's still a negative compared to more modern glass pad releases. And the base, despite its great performance, wasn't installed correctly on my unit and wasn't fully covering the pad's base, and of course due to its raised hexagonal texturing, it does collect dust and debris and it's very difficult to clean, so the base always looks dirty. So while there are some positive aspects to the RAZER Atlas, the pad's age is again its Achilles heel, as it's just too outdated for me to recommend in today's hard pad market. But if the pad's price was adjusted to account for its age, retailing for say 70 Canadian dollars, it'd be easier to recommend, but at its current price you're much better off purchasing some of the countless balanced glass pads that are available on the market, which will not only have more modern designs, larger sizes, useful accessories, better base types, and a myriad of other benefits. The other pads can also be purchased at a much cheaper price compared to the Atlas's MSRP. But while the Atlas isn't a glass pad I recommend you buy today, despite the many positives to this pad, I do think RAZER has a good foundation here with the Atlas, and I'd love to see them develop an Atlas V2, which keeps the same style surfacing and sensor compatibility as well as performance profiles, but in a larger, thinner form factor with an updated, easier to clean base that include accessories such as a cleaning cloth, glass optimized skates, an arm sleeve, and even stickers. If RAZER 2 will release an Atlas V2 similar to what I just outlined and they retailed it for more competitive pricing than they did with the Atlas V1, I honestly think it'd be a great pad and it'd be one that'd be able to compete quite well in the current glass pad market, but I can't say the same for the Atlas V1, as while it's a great pad in terms of performance and its surfacing design, it's just too outdated in other aspects of its design for me to recommend. But hopefully RAZER isn't done with the Atlas lineup, and hopefully we'll see an improved Atlas V2 in the near future. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Big thank you again to RAZER for sending over the Atlas for review, I greatly appreciate it, and big thank you to all of our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you'd like to support my efforts with these in-depth reviews and the Teardown project, consider becoming a member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a channel member also gives you early access to all upcoming content here on the channel, so if you want to support what I do here, become a channel member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the RAZER Atlas, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.